Hey PC Gamers, and welcome back to the PC Gamer Chat Log. I'm Lauren Morton.
And hey everyone, I'm Mollie Taylor.
And this week, Mollie and I are bringing on senior editor Wes Fenlon to talk about games that failed to launch, or games that launched and then unlaunched. We recently saw Concord go through this, of course. It's been a bit of a talking point. Lots of people have opinions on why that happened, and I don't think anybody truly knows the answer, right? Like, nobody knows exactly why that happened. There are just lots of guesses. But we wanted to talk about some other cases of games that just didn't quite make it out the door, or quickly just pressed undo on coming out. And what happened? Some of them wound up being successes later. Some of them are other cautionary tales. But yeah, not to celebrate this happening to Concord, obviously, just to talk about the effect, this thing that we're seeing happening more often, and kind of what it means for us as PC gamers. But before we get into that, Mollie, what did you play last week?
Yeah, so I've still got my usuals in rotation. I've still got Final Fantasy 14 and Nikkei that I'm playing like on a semi-regular basis. I still haven't cleared the tier. I'm so sorry.
No.
I progged it for the first time in like 5 weeks. And that went really well. So I need to give myself one last little push where I'm not super tired and I actually have time to like sit down and sweat the raid out for a few hours. Everyone's like super geared now and all of my friends have done it. So I could like get the carry if I wanted to. We'll see. We'll see this time next week where I end up on that. But I've been busting out the Nintendo consoles. I have had like the weirdest hankering to play Guitar Hero. I don't know where it came from. Yeah, like I think I played a game of it in like my local arcade, and I was like, man, I really want to play Guitar Hero. And I like sat on it all week because I have it on the Wii. So I'm like, I don't really want to like get my Wii out, set the Wii up, and then be like, play one song of Guitar Hero and be like, ugh, I can't bother anymore. Because that's what always happens. That's always what happens. But I finally did it. Like Friday came. I was like, it's the weekend. I'm going to get the Wii out. I'm going to get out my Guitar Hero guitar. And I played a bunch. I played so much Guitar Hero this weekend. It's actually kind of crazy. I've been labbing the orange button. I've been like trying to practice because I like growing up, I have small hands. So like growing up, I would only ever play medium because, you know, 4 fingers, 4 buttons. But I was determined. I was like, I want to learn how to play the orange button. I want to learn the hard.
Reach for it.
I want to reach for it. So I played like a bunch of Guitar Hero. I was just like sat there for hours playing like a bunch of different hard charts. And it was really fun. I don't remember the last time I just sat and played Guitar Hero for like a bunch of hours by myself. And it was really good. It was really, really good. And then I had like a little like Nintendo like date night with my boyfriend as well. So we played some Smash because he's a little nerd and he loves Smash. So we played some Smash Bros. And we played some Mario Kart. So yeah, it's been like not much of a PC gaming week. Bit more
so like very, very classic gaming weekend. Yeah.
Very classic gaming week and weekend. A lot of like lying flat on the sofa and occasionally having to like sit up to activate star power on the guitar, and then I've like lie back down again. Yeah, like I said, very classic gaming week actually. So yeah, that was me. That's what I got up to.
Nice. I finally tried Rekka for myself, the Streepy Witch in the Woods game. Yes. Cara Phillips wrote about it on the website for us because I was like, I don't have time for it because of an event that I'm at. Cara, please give this game some attention, the one that I was so excited for. And she had a very good time. And then I finally got to get into it this weekend. And it starts like very intense, more than I was expecting. Most like, it's like a crafting, cooking, adventuring, like very vibed. It's based on like Slavic folklore of Eastern Germany. That's where its developers are from. And it's like all vibes when you jump in, but then you're immediately like meeting Baba Yaga in the woods and like doing a ritual to bring the chicken-legged house to life. And it was like kind of intense. And I was like, oh, it's not just dropping me in and saying like, go pick some berries, have fun, like most crafting games do. So it was very fun to start. The first thing I did was help a woman who kept losing her baby goats. One of them kept getting out of the fence, so I went and I found it. And she lost it so many times that her neighbors were annoyed with her and were like, didn't want to help anymore. And I was like, I'm just going to walk away with this baby goat. Like, I still had it in my hands. And I was like, instead of putting it back where it goes, I'm just going to walk away and I'm going to go back to my house. And I was just doing it for the memes. I was just like joking around. But then I got to the doorstep of my house and it said, do you want to keep this animal? I forget what the exact prompt is, but it was like, keep animal or let it go. And I was like, oh no, I'm fully keeping it. Yes, and keeping her baby goat. So that was my first acquisition in Rekka, was stealing a woman's goat because she wasn't taking proper care of it. Okay, it was neglected. So that's what I accomplished. Great evening for me. And then the other thing is that I can finally talk about playing Dragon Age, the Veil Guard, as of today. Today's the day. I mentioned it last week that I had been in an event with lots of other folks you've seen posting on social media about it. I don't want to say too much here because, as we've said before, we're writers that have a podcast by accident. I'm more eloquent in written form, and I've not finished writing that as of the moment that I'm speaking right now. I'm not finished writing it. By the time you hear this, it will be finished and it'll be on the website. But I haven't figured out the exact words I want to use yet, so I don't want to accidentally get myself clipped being ineloquent. But what I will say is I like what they did with the combat system. We had lots of doubters on the team, among whom I was
naysayers.
One. Yeah, I was one of the naysayers. As I said weeks back on this podcast, I knew they weren't going to make an old style CRPG. I knew that was like, they weren't going to do that, obviously. I just didn't think it was going to be as actiony as it wound up being. And all the things we kept hearing about the combat, I was a little bit frustrated. I was a little bit disillusioned. I was like, I don't want this. And it still is not what I would have picked. It's not what I wanted for the series. But was it fun when I put my hands on it? Yes, it was. It was quite fun, actually. It was actually very hectic. I was having a good time. I was playing a warrior, and I was having a great time. There are bits that are a little bit silly. You like straight up Captain America shield throw, because every class has like a ranged something. And like as a mage and an archer, it makes sense. As a warrior, they're like, you just throw your shield. I'm like, that's a little silly. I don't know if I like how silly that is, but actually playing it, doing the combat was very fun. So they've converted me on that part, at least. Like I said, I'm gonna be like a tiny little hater always, because it's not what I wanted, but I'm going to admit, of course, that they did a great job, and I think I will actually have fun playing that part of it. So well done, BioWare. Good job. You got me. I'm sorry. You got me. You win. And with that out of the way, then we will go grab Wes and we'll talk about a different BioWare game among lots of other games. Okay, Wes, today we are bringing you in to talk about games that have unlaunched or sort of failed to launch. The most recent example that we were all thinking about, of course, is Concord. And basically after that happened, you went out and you were like, okay, wait, let's look at a few other times this has happened and like what might happen next, or like what else has happened. So what did you discover when you were picking who to feature in that?
Does this make this topic more or less depressing that there are plenty of examples, unfortunately, of games that have not had a great launch? And I think there was a time when we would expect a game that doesn't have a great launch to kind of just like soldier on. Maybe it turns things around.
Yeah.
Maybe it just kind of is a small game and drops support after a while. But Concord is not the first time a game has kind of failed to launch so spectacularly that the publisher or developer decided like they need to take more dramatic immediate action, though it was among the most dramatic and immediate that
not
we've
even the first time
seen.
this year.
That's true.
Literally, not even that.
Which is crazy. And actually, because of the situation that Concord was in, which was basically it got not enough attention, no attention, nobody seems to care. Please remind us what Concord is for all of the people who apparently didn't know or care. Like, that was the problem. You shady fucking bitch.
I feel bad that like this game has gotten far more attention and notoriety for being a failure than it did for being like an okay shooter, right?
Right.
So everybody listening to this probably knows what Concord is, unless it's like if you're listening to this outside the probably 3-month window of Concord's launch, you maybe not know what it is. But so yeah, it was a first-person shooter developed by I think largely a group of former Destiny folks, people who worked at Bungie, or at least that was like kind of the core founding team. I'm not sure how big the team ended up being. And it was published by Sony. Sony picked up, or PlayStation, they picked up the studio, I think a year or two before the game came out to, be its publisher. They own the studio, and they did a beta about maybe 2 months before the launch. And the beta really did not excite people. Like, it did not pop off at all. Right. And it was free. It was an open beta. So I think maybe people kind of saw the writing on the wall that like this launch was not going to be too big. But it can be a little hard to judge because it's a console game and a PC game, right? It launched on both simultaneously. We can see the Steam numbers. We know how many people are playing the game on Steam, but we had no idea how many people were playing it on PlayStation. I think you can see like maybe in the charts, like kind of roughly where a game is positioned. So we knew it was not like the number one game on PlayStation, right? But we didn't have like hard player numbers on it. And so a lot of people have pointed to the fact that this was a $40 hero shooter going up against a lot of free games as the reason for its failure. And I think it's more complicated than that, right? I mean, we saw it with Helldivers 2 this year. That was, similarly like a premium price game that did absolutely phenomenally.
Done really well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, it's a complicated thing. And I think sometimes it's just a matter of timing. I don't know if Concord was going to ever be a smash hit, but maybe there was a certain time or just a certain way they could have marketed this game differently that would have caught enough people's attention for it to at least be, a modest success or even a modest disappointment, right?
Yeah, I think the marketing was really, for me anyway, like the only kind of bit of marketing that I even ended up seeing was the very lengthy segment it had in the May State of Play, I think it was.
It was like a cinematic, right?
Yeah, it was like a very long cinematic, and then I think it was followed up with like a couple dev, talking head kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And I remember just watching it and just being like very disinterested and just thinking like, this really is not for me. Like, I can appreciate a hero shooter. I just think it wasn't really doing enough for me. And I guess a lot of other people felt that way. I think it just ended up being one of those things that faded into the background.
It reminds me a little bit of how some games, some multiplayer games that have really not launched successfully, basically tried to establish themselves as an esport on day one. Like, they're coming in, their initial pitch for the game is, this is a competitive game. Like, we're going for esports. Like, we're having all these features, all these things to like cater to the competitive audience. And I feel like that's really the wrong way to go about launching almost any competitive game. Like, okay, you can think about, is your game balanced? Does it appeal to like a high school player? But you can't assume you're going to have a big competitive scene wanting to play your game before the launch. I think you need to focus on making the game compelling to like just normal people first.
To the everyday player. Street Fighter 5 made the exact same mistake, right? Where they were like, they launched the game very competitive minded and everyone freaking hated it when it
didn't even have like an arcade mode, right? That you could just play against, the normal kind of thing that every fighting game has had for decades. So Concord was a little different. They weren't doing like the esports pitch, but they were doing like the hero shooter new universe pitch. And they were like, come look at our characters. Like, we've come up with these awesome characters. The characters are the key to the game. This is what we think people are going to come and love. And like, I can see how you get to that point by reverse engineering from Overwatch and from like people eating up the cinematics for those characters, right? But I think you can't start with that. You're like skipping a couple steps of inherent buy-in to that stuff before you really like start pushing it and celebrating it. And I think that pitch sort of like ate up the opportunity to really talk about the game, right? And be like, this is what makes our shooter really, really unique when you're actually playing it. So I think that was a big problem for it. But we're here to talk about other games.
Yeah. And also
on top of Concord, right?
How long did Concord last? in total? Was it weeks? I think
it 11
was,
days?
Right?
13
was
days?
It 11 days? Was that as long as it lasted?
That's about
I thought it was
right.
like 3 weeks. Oh my goodness.
It was just under 2, I believe.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Maybe it was 14. It was right around that
That's
area.
kind of crazy because, like you said earlier, like I think back, mid 2010s maybe, I think the expectation was just that it was perhaps more beneficial financially to just let it continue to run for a little bit. But we are seeing increasingly just developers or publishers pulling a game very quickly, or games not even seeing a launch.
Yeah, because what we saw happen in Concord's case, right, was it lasted just those few days, less than 2 weeks. We saw the servers go offline. It got pulled offline. I think refunds were issued right to everybody. And yeah, basically just the game, they just pulled the whole
Vanished.
thing. Yeah, which was a very, I don't know, tidy is not the word I want to use for that happening. But as a very tidy, like, whoops, we'll just pitch it. And that's not how this always goes. What other ways has this gone from the other games that you were looking at, Wes?
Yeah, so I was coming at this from the perspective of, not really trying to predict, because who knows what will happen, but like laying out the possibilities for, does Concord come back in some form? Like, are they going to relaunch it in some way? Or is this game just dead, right? And
they've implied that a relaunch is coming, right? In some capacity. Whether that happens.
I think it was very open-ended.
Yeah, they said they're exploring options, I think was the exact phrase that was used.
There you go.
That's interesting, because like the nearest comparison to that then would be like Fortnite, right? What happened with Fortnite? I guess it depends on what form a relaunch would take if that happens, but that's sort of what happened there, right?
If you're thinking about it from the perspective of the game coming back in a different form, right? Then that was what Fortnite did incredibly successfully. Notably, Fortnite was not taken offline, but it's hard to remember now that Fortnite is, the institution that it is, that it was in development for like 8 years at Epic. They were really struggling to make this like kind of weird co-op. Maybe it wasn't even weird. The initial pitch was like, let's take that Gears of War like horde mode, co-op mode, where you're like kind of doing some very simple building, playing with your friends, killing, the zombies or whoever's like attacking your base. They eventually managed to spin that out into Fortnite with this entire building system and like it's very cartoony aesthetic that let you do, big scale stuff, right? So it's kind of in the era of like DayZ, really changing people's opinions around like what an open world survival kind of game can be. And so they were kind of doing a little bit of that, kind of doing the horde mode thing. And it launched and people were like, yeah, it's okay. But like
now that you remind me of that, I'm thinking other than the art style, I'm like, why was I not playing Fortnite? I was on the ground. Mollie knows I talk about this all the time. I was playing PUBG at the time. I wasn't playing DayZ, but I was playing PUBG. I was playing other things that like H1Z1. I was originally playing H1Z1 before it did the battle royale mode.
You were just too hardcore for launch Fortnite.
Was this Save the World, or was this like their attempt at something else?
Yeah, before? So they retroactively called it Save the World, I believe. I think they needed a subtitle for it once Battle Royale launched. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you could consider that initial launch of Fortnite a failure. Like, it was certainly not, that was not like the game Epic needed or wanted at the time to, make them a bunch of money, like rise their star. I think they were really reliant on Unreal Engine to bring in money at that point. They had sold off Gears of War. Unreal Tournament was pretty dead. Even Unreal Engine wasn't doing great at that point. I think this was like Unreal 4. It had taken a really long time to get people to adopt Unreal 4. So I think they needed a win then. Maybe they weren't going to go out of business, but like they wanted a game that people were actively playing and was making money, right? And so very quickly they looked at, PUBG was incredibly successful at this point, and they made a battle royale mode in like a few months. They were just like, well, we have this whole building system. We have made a third person shooter. What if we put a circle on the map that shrinks? And they made a battle royale mode really fast, and just that was like the right cocktail of ingredients at that time, right? To have the building mode in there gave it enough of a difference from PUBG. It was like it was a lot more accessible. It was a lot less hardcore than PUBG in terms of like the aiming mechanics and movement and that stuff. And it just like everything clicked for it, and it did super duper well, right?
Yeah.
That's like the fastest pivot I think a game has ever made that has paid off in a successful way, right?
As you're describing that, that's what's funny to me, is because we talk all the time about, when you see games come out very close to each other that have a lot of similarities, sometimes the player response is to say, oh, well, this is a ripoff of that. And you're like, things do not happen that fast. You cannot see a trend shoot up and then start developing your game that day. I mean, look, maybe if you're making, what folks would refer to as an asset sort of flip or like something like that, maybe things have gotten a lot faster. But for the most part, things don't happen that fast. You don't jump on a trend from day one watching it happen. You have apparently a game that didn't take off, and you have the architecture, and you say, well, I guess we can just sort of like shove it into this trend of battle royales that are taking off right now.
And it worked. Yeah, I think
it worked.
It fucking worked. I think Final Fantasy 14 is like, it's like tangential, I think, in it being another one where they kind of unlaunched it, right? They were like, we're getting rid of how it is, and they took, I forget how long they took, like 6 months maybe, with it totally offline and brought it back. And I mean,
it did go offline for a time. I didn't remember that.
It went offline. Yeah, they worked it into the story, so they did a quest line that basically like nuked that just like nuked the 1.0 version. Then it went offline when that all happened, and then it came back. I think came back in August of 2013. So maybe like 6 months to a year after they shut it down, I believe. And then I mean, it's still going like 10 years later. So
and it's huge. I mean, imagine playing at that point and like an MMO and seeing it like sort of fail and watching it go offline and thinking it's going to come back. But like, what if it doesn't though? Like that like, seems like such a long shot. I feel like, I feel like I would be a player of that and being like, okay, they're not coming back from this.
It's
like,
not coming back.
No matter what they've said or not said.
I had that same thought with multiverses when because multiverses is like kind of a special case, right? Like the other games we talked about, like Fortnite, they pivoted because Save the World was doing bad. Final Fantasy 14, they shut down because 1.0 was bad. But multiverses like launched, and then they were like, this is an open beta.
Was not a failure, critically. Not a failed game at all, by any means.
Not
very
a failed
popular
game. They said, this is an open beta. We're going to take the feedback and work on it, but we're taking the game offline. And that was such a weird situation to me. Like, I think I wrote as well that I was not very confident in that game's ability to relaunch, and it did. It came back earlier this year. Is it amazing? No. Has a lot changed? Some of it's changed. They switched engine, they fixed some of like the glaring issues, but it's still, I don't know how long it's gonna last, but it came back. It did something I didn't think it was gonna do. So
Mollie, you're the fighting game. Well, Wes, you're also a fighting game person. Really, I'm the only one who's not. But like, from
much more Mollie than me.
Like, I remember it being very popular, Multiverses, the open beta for it. I mean, was it because they took it offline to then like do feedback? Was that an issue? Like, I feel like people liked it up to that point.
The beta was online for like 9 months or something like that.
It was a long time.
It was a long time. It had really, really strong initial numbers, I think largely on the back of like, someone on PC is making, a big
Smash
budget
Bros.
Or like medium budget Smash Bros game.
Yeah.
That was just like exciting to see. And it had some pretty creative like applications of the characters, right? Like there were some good moves in there, some kind of meme-y stuff that really caught on for the internet. I think just like fundamentally, it wasn't a game that was going to sustain a huge, audience. Like fighting games are still relatively niche, right? Like Street Fighter 6 just passed 4 million sales last month, I think. And that's like 4 million is a great number, right? But that is the most famous fighting game series of all time, right? It's not the best selling, but like that's a huge name. So for Multiverses to, you know, only have in the tens of thousands of like daily players or single digit thousands of daily players, that doesn't seem to me like a failure. But for Warner Brothers, maybe that's not where they want that number to be for like a live service game that they plan to pump money into for a long time, right? So they decided to relaunch it, and yeah, I mean, what could they do between the end of that open beta and a relaunch that is going to make it like a game people want to play for years, right? Like it is still fundamentally a Smash Bros style like arena fighting game. I don't know, Molly, like do you feel like they did the things they needed to do to make more people interested in it, or was there even like a path to making that game, you know, more than just kind of like the size audience that, I don't know, you or I would maybe guess that it would have playing it on a normal day?
I don't know. I think, like, you know, they fixed some of the hitbox, hurtbox stuff, and they fixed some of the movement, and, you know, some, like I said, some of the more glaring issues did get fixed, but I think ultimately it was just, I don't know why it lost wind like so fast. I don't know if like the monetization was putting people off, because, you know, they had like these like $100 founders packs, and then on top of that it was like a battle pass and like paid currency, and, you know, it was very much giving like free to play monetization with like a not free to play price tag. So I'm not really sure, like, I don't know if coming offline kind of killed a lot of the momentum, because the subreddit was still very excited. Like, if you would peep like the community, they were excited for the relaunch, and then the relaunch kind of happened and people weren't super jazzed about it. Again, I think the monetization was playing like a big factor in that, and, you know, there's like a lot of quests that require you to have like a certain character, or like a character with a certain tag, and not everyone had that. And then they didn't like the fact that it's like you have to spend money just to complete like daily missions or weekly missions. Like, so like, I'm not overly sure. I just think maybe people were like kind of hot on it at first, and they went all in. They had like a massive esports thing for it as well. They did like a huge thing at Evo, and then I think people just lost interest. I think that is just one of the unfortunate cases where I think there was like a novelty to it, and the novelty just wasn't enough to keep people like engaged with it.
And the game like is doing okay, right? Like it still has people playing it. You know, it has many thousands of players. It's probably doing better at its lowest point than, unfortunately, Concord did, you know, ever in its launch, right? But that brings up like two things for me. One is I think people have a lot of opinions about what games should cost, whether it should be the upfront price of the game or the free-to-play monetization. I think very rarely is that actually the killing blow for a game. Yeah. Like, occasionally a free-to-play game's monetization is so bad that destroys the game. Like, that, for sure, that does happen. But I think often complaints about the monetization are going to be a symptom of how much investment people already have in the game, right? Like, people will shell out a lot of money for stuff in Dota 2 because they really, really, really like Dota 2, right? People will spend stupid amounts of money for Counter-Strike knives because they love that game and they play shitloads of that game. I think Concord selling at a $40, premium, that did stop more people from playing it than would have played it if it was a free-to-play game, but the beta was free, and that did not do well either, right? So, like Morgan on our team, who he liked Concord, like he didn't think it was amazing, but he was kind of pro the game. He was kind of kept pointing out, like, the way people talk about the pricing of this game, they're not talking about the fact that, like, it doesn't have a monthly battle pass that you have to play like 100 hours of this game just to unlock, the new character at the end of the battle pass. It doesn't have like really expensive cosmetics the way some free-to-play games do. And maybe a lot of the audience don't care if those free-to-play games have those expensive skins in them or have the battle pass because they can just ignore that stuff, or they're already playing a lot of it anyway. But I think there is like a core audience of people kind of like me who will go, well, I would rather just pay for this game than see all of that junk in the game that I've seen in 100 other games. But like, I didn't buy Concord, and there's only a lot of people who like philosophically are like, yeah, like premium games, great, but they're not going to buy every premium game that comes along. It has to be the one that grabs you. So my big takeaway from looking at some of these other games that Lauren mentioned in the article at the top of the episode is like, sometimes it's okay for a game to die. Like they're not all wins, right? Like all of us have done something and made something in our life where we're just like, well, that one just didn't work, right? Okay, like got to move on to the next one. And it's really upsetting and sad and like affects people's lives when it's a multi-million-dollar game. Like, I don't want to celebrate that, but not every game is gonna make it. And like Crucible was one of the first examples I put in this article, right?
Yeah.
Which was an Amazon
I nearly
shooter.
forgot about that thing.
Yeah, it was like a third-person shooter, kind of Battleborn adjacent, that came out and had virtually no interest in it. Like almost no one played it. They left it online for a couple months, decided to roll it back into beta testing and like try to kind of redo the game, gave that a few months, and then they pulled the plug because they were just like, this is a sunk cost. There's no way we're going to realistically turn this into a big game that a lot of people want to play. The flaws are too deep, or something about it is just not appealing to enough people. Let's cut our losses and move on. And so I don't know if that's the case for Concord. Maybe there's a version of that game they could salvage and turn into something people really like. Sometimes you got to take the L and move on. And I hope that doesn't mean, a publisher going, well, we don't need this studio anymore, so let's just get rid of all these people. That's the bad outcome for sure. But sometimes it's okay to just chalk something up to not working and try something else.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is not a pure art industry or medium. This is a consumer products medium, and some products flop, it turns out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they sure do. How long did Crucible last? You say a few months in the end?
Yeah, it had a couple months online, and then they moved it back into beta for several more, like closed beta for several more months, where they played it with, a very small group of testers. But then they killed it, So yeah, it was a span of months, not days, but it still was not very long. Before Concord, that was like one of the notable, very quick turnarounds for a game to unlaunch. There had not been many before that point. Since then, we've had Artifact from Valve, the card game, where that's the perfect example of sometimes it just doesn't work, right? Like if anyone should be able to do an incredible card
whatever
game,
they want.
Yeah, do whatever they want. Spend as much time like coming up with the best design possible. They brought the creator of Magic the Gathering on board to design this card game, right? Like Richard Garfield, and it just didn't appeal to people. Like they seemingly like over designed a card game, which I think is a risk when you have incredibly skilled people with the goal of like looking at everything in that space and going, okay, we want to make a game that's not like Magic, it's not like Hearthstone, it's not like Gwent, it's not like one of these, whatever the other ones are. We want people to be playing it for 10 years, like taking all imaginable data and putting it together and using that to like craft the perfect card game. And sometimes you just like overthink, and miss the like core appeal or core simplicity or something, right? And so that was another game where they basically unlaunched it, took it back into like some form of beta, tested it with a certain number of players, and they worked on it for like a year or something like that. They mentioned in the article, and then finally just, we're just like, okay, we gotta
gave up on it.
Yeah, we gotta call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, another one, Anthem, I guess, is like a pretty different situation. This is actually an outlier in a different way that you also talked about was, of course, this was the, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, it's a sci-fi online game that was done by BioWare, in which BioWare was doing a not very BioWare thing of an online RPG. And I think they were
action RPG.
Yeah, and I think there were compliments about some of the things in there about like the cool, Iron Man-ass suit flying around and whatnot. But ultimately, I think people ran into performance issues, bug issues. There wasn't a big enough player base. People had problems with it, and BioWare basically said, "Okay, we're going back to the drawing board. We're gonna put in time to fix Anthem. We're not gonna let this just, totally fail. We're not going to pull it offline." And notably, they have not pulled it offline. It has stuck around. Have they revamped it and had any kind of comeback? No, but it is
still online.
It's still on mine, Molly. You could
play
it if you wanted to.
I could buy and play Anthem in the year of our Lord 2024.
Was it a premium game?
$30. Yeah, it's $30
really?
I think.
Oh,
yeah.
I couldn't even remember that
had
part.
it had a single player campaign, single player co-op campaign. People I think were really not digging the loot grind and kind of the rewards you would get for playing it. Clearly it didn't have enough stuff to do in the game, and they weren't able to sort of fix some of the core problems while also putting out meaningful expansions. So yeah, it was just a flop, unfortunately. But they did spend a good chunk of time going, should we really commit to this game and spend the next 3 years digging ourselves out of the hole of the fundamental problems so that we can make more hashtag content for this game and make people happy. And eventually they made the call of just you gotta let it die, right? We gotta move on and do something else. And I think that was the right choice. I think once a game has that degree of sort of the audience has so soured on the experience that even turning it around to being solid, if not exceptional, is a very difficult, time-consuming process that isn't going to satisfy people in the end, right? You're not going to suddenly have everybody go, oh, Anthem's pretty good now. I guess we should flock to this live service game in massive numbers, right? People are just going to move on at that point. So
and this is why trend chasing doesn't work, because EA, you don't need your own Destiny 2. I'm so sorry, you can't have it. We already have Destiny 2 at home, and it has its own problems that its players, complain and ask for changes on all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, Sony's not super happy about having its own Destiny 2 at the moment. I think
it's really up and down all the time. Season to season, I swear, the opinions on Destiny change.
I think we're hitting a point for live service games where it's very obvious that it's tough for a game like Concord to break in when we have these established games that have, we have these sort of monument games, right? We have our pillar games. There's a lot of people who just play Fortnite. There's a lot of people who just play Apex. There's a lot of people who just play, League or something outside the shooter space. And if you're trying to break in with a new game, you're competing against those games. But those games are also constantly just competing against themselves. So I think we're seeing a point where it's difficult to break into that established space, but it's also really hard to keep those games going and keep them attracting either more players or even sustaining the same number of players. Going back to my depressing analysis that it's some games just should die. I think live service games should not be on life support forever. There is actually a length of time where a game should exist, and maybe it has run its course, and maybe it's better for the people creating it and the people playing it to just get something fresh in their life, right? Imagine if you were writing the same article for 10 years. That would that would get pretty rough, right?
Make it end.
It's really nice to be able to start something fresh and feel that wave of freedom again, and you could kind of go in any direction with something. And I feel like Destiny is a game that probably should have run 5 years or something like that, 7 years, and then let's create something wholly new, launch something fresh. But you get so much money invested in these games, and there's so much risk in starting over. And what if you only get 10, 20, 50% of the people that you had on the last one? Well, you can't sink $200 million into a new game if you only are going to get a small portion of that audience to come over, right? So it's financially it's a very hazardous place, but I feel creatively I would like to see a lot of these live service games go the Final Fantasy 14 route. Like that was obviously a case where they had to salvage something versus like a game that was successful. But starting over is good. Starting clean slate. I think more of these games should do that at some point.
Should give it more than 11 days though, right? It should give it more than 11 days. Like I do have to wonder, like, is it really that much more financially like beneficial after they've poured like, I forget the number that was floating around for Concord's development. It was significantly high, if I remember correctly. And I know they were never gonna, recoup those costs with the way that launched. But I do have to wonder, was it really like cheaper to just pull it, cut their losses and just take the L than it was to keep it running for like 6 months and see what happens?
My feeling is if they are going to relaunch it, it was better to rip off the Band-Aid the way they did than let it linger. If they're not going to relaunch it, I don't know. I don't know if that was the right move or not, but maybe it would have just sort of been sad for it to kind of sit around with that, that few players. Like Halo Infinite had a very long, slow comeback after kind of losing like its initial excitement around players. And I think even at its, lowest, it still was many, many times more played than Concord. So I think maybe it was the right call, as painful as it was. But hopefully it means that they're able to come back with, like, yes, they will have that sort of mark of shame of like the failed launch, but they won't have the like, wow, this game, dragged out for 6 months and was just sort of like sitting there. Like there's sort of a different kind of comeback story, I think, that they have the opportunity for that I hope they have. But yeah, we talked about we made some notes for some other kind of games for this episode that I thought would be fun to talk about. Lauren, I know you're a big MMO player, or you recovering MMO player, I should say. I wrote down a few games that I thought were really cool examples of games that did die under very sad circumstances, but the community have actually been able to resurrect them. Were you ever a City of Heroes player? That's like the big marquee example now.
I don't do superheroes, man.
Yeah. Well, that's a game that like the community brought back. They did private servers, and they've actually gotten like official approval from NCSoft to like keep operating, which is...
That's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like the best case scenario, right? That they're able to run it the way they want it, and the publisher is just like, yeah, okay, we're not going to DMCA you, we're not going to sue you, we'll just let it run.
Yeah.
The same thing has happened minus that official approval for Warhammer Online, which like I had friends playing that game when it came out who really liked it, and it just kind of never, I don't know what its issue it was exactly, but it didn't sustain. Star Wars Galaxies, even EverQuest. EverQuest is sort of a weird one because they have a very successful, actively played, like official servers that are still online, but also there are private servers. So yeah, I think MMOs are kind of the rare space where people care about these games so much, and they're able to get the data by playing the game, and like people are able to download enough stuff that they can kind of recreate it. Which, unfortunately is not an option for a game like Concord. But you did note that there's this like petition going around to force game developers to make their games like playable after death, which is seems unrealistic to me, but it's an interesting appeal.
Yeah, you're like starting to get into the territory of like what I wanted to talk about. So we've been talking about games as like this abstract, like amorphous thing, like the game living or dying, right? But there's also the angle of like, we are players in these games. We like are invested in this thing that we have access to, or potentially we've bought. And yeah, trying to figure out like what we are owed for that, I guess. And, whether we want to still have access to a thing that we've been playing, and it's, through community servers, through petitioning and trying to get legislation passed, which I've kind of been saying for years. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet, because I think the like getting money tied up in it, and I think they're using the right words. They're saying things like consumer rights is how you get legislation attention or something like that. And I think their initial response from like the UK government was basically like, we can't make them support old software, sorry. But yeah, I think it's the money thing. Mollie, you started to indicate this with like the microtransactions in multiverses, because when you have a situation like Concord, right? Premium game, went offline very quickly. You can make kind of a clean break. You give refunds. We're clean. But with something like multiverses, yeah, the game is online for 9 months. People really didn't think it was going to go offline. I assume people thought it was kind of like they called it a beta, but really it was early access and it would just flip over into full launch at some point. So you've bought microtransactions in it. And then when it goes offline, for even if it's just temporarily, like, ooh, that doesn't feel good. Like,
yeah, it was strange. And the thing that they did was that they made it so that, because you could still play it offline, right? And they made everything unlockable. So everything, all of like, everything was unlocked, but only for the period when it was offline. And then I'm not quite sure how it's worked for the relaunch, but the agreement was essentially like, you can have everything until we relaunch.
Right.
So I don't really know like what happened fully after that, to be honest.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's the part that's been curious to me, is I think it's going to take a high profile, messy enough one of these situations for, I think, more opinions about rules or regulation or consumer rights or whatever else. Because yeah, it does suck if one of these turns messy and you've spent money on a thing with how much games cost now, for it to very quickly relaunch into a different product or go offline for 6 months or do something else. Some of these situations can get kind of sloppy,
a little bit dicey,
I guess. Yeah.
I think it gets really like legally thorny to force game studios or publishers to release a version of their game that you can play offline forever, when like a good chunk of that game may be, you know, the code for that game, elements of it, they may be planning to use in the sequel to do something with, like it. That, I think I'm completely behind it from like an ethical perspective, but I feel like from a legal perspective, it's really tough, and I don't see it making sense. But I would
There's
love
a reason nobody's going to want to touch it.
Yeah. But like we've just seen Ubisoft, I think, announce like this week or last week that they're going to add like offline play for the Crew racing game, which was like one of the
that they pulled.
Yeah, which was like part of the impetus for this petition, right? So I think I'm in favor of things like this existing to at least like hold developers' feet to the fire a little bit, and like if it gets them to voluntarily do these things a little more often rather than it being this like very questionable draconian legal framework, then like that's awesome. I loved what the Knockout City devs did last year or the year before, when they're like, unfortunately that was a live service game that we thought was really fun, didn't have the staying power, right? It lasted like a year or so.
It was about
and then,
a year,
yeah. And then they were just like, okay, we can't keep sustaining, you know, this game. Not enough people are playing it, but they made a way to let people play private servers once they shut it down. And that's super cool. Like I would love to see more games do that. Rumbleverse was kind of in the same time frame as Knockout City, and like kind of a similar like it's this very cartoony, like
similar vibe,
you know, action combat game with a whole wrestling aesthetic made by Iron Galaxy, who I think is a really cool studio. And I never played this game. I don't play a lot of live service games, but I kind of wanted to. Like it looked fun. It was one of those games that I was thinking about like dragging some friends into, like dipping in, and then it died like 6 months 6 months later. And I was like, damn, like I did actually kind of want to play that. I would have loved it if they had made, you know, a private server mode for it. And would have it had a lot of players? No, but it probably would have had, you know, a few hundred players on a daily basis, which would have been enough for me to go in and try it out. So I hope more developers do that. But I think there's a lot of legal, you know, issues there. There's a lot of like questions of, are they shooting themselves in the foot for their next game if they let that game stay out there in perpetuity. Are they going to be competing against a free version of themselves? The reality is it's very expensive to make games, right? So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that was the stop killing games petition is what we've been referencing. I don't know if we actually said the name out loud, but that's what it was called. That's so interesting that you mentioned that, Wes, that effect of like, what, Molly?
No, I was moving on to something else.
I was just going to quickly say it's so funny to think about that happening with like you see a new restaurant in town, you're like, I should try that at some point, and then eventually you're like, oh, it's gone. Oh no, I never tried it.
Yeah, that's happened to me so many times. But no, I was gonna say, like, obviously we've spoken about Concord at length because it's very recent. I don't know how Concord has somehow managed to, I don't know how to say this politely, has managed to fuck up the day before.
Oh gosh,
in its like kind of launch fiasco. I mean, I don't actually know. I think the day before may have fucked up Concord, but the day before is like perhaps the other very prolific game this year that launched, and I think within hours they were like, we're taking it away, have your refunds, goodbye.
I think the difference there was I just don't think anybody was moved by Concord one way or another, and
which is very sad.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. The thing about the day before is it was the most wishlisted game on Steam. And people had been talking for months, nay, a year, nay, maybe multiple years. Wondering if this game was real. There were conspiracy theories about this game. Every time a trailer or gameplay would come out, everybody's like, this is fake. It's not real. It's not even a functional game. It's like, it's all just a cardboard play set and you're going to knock it down and there's nothing there. Like, and it kind of turned out that kind of might have been the case. Like it really did just sort of fall over, and you were like,
it was a little asset flippy, right? If I remember correctly, there was like accusations of it being in a bit of like an asset
accusations. I don't remember. Yeah.
There was also just not much of a quality game there, right? Like there
wasn't much to it.
It was very clearly an act of, in all the videos, like a magician's trick, of like, look over here, look at this hand while the other hand is hiding, like, sweeping away the bits of game that are super janky. Yeah, exactly. So the game came out, and I think within 4 days, the studio shut down. So like clearly it was, they were really trying to put on a strong front for that game, but the fundamental, like, I think they just got kind of too big for their britches, right? Like they should have made a much smaller scale game that took way less time, cost way less money, made way more reasonable, promises to players with its trailers and presentation. And maybe people would have played it and been like, you made an okay game, right? But you can't go around making a game that gets that kind of pull and is making those sort of promises of what it's going to be capable of, and then it comes out and it looks like the day before it did.
You've also got the games that didn't even release, right? Like this year, Life by You had several release dates,
and then it was 2 weeks away from launch.
And they just
said,
so as far as like coming out.
The difference between that game launching and not launching, right? I mean, not a lot of difference in what the playable product was, right? Like 2 weeks wasn't going to make much of a difference. So if that game had launched, it would have been.
It was there.
Although
it was ready.
And a single player game isn't going to unlaunch, right? That's not a thing that's going to happen. But because of course that was a life simulation with single player. So I think they would have just been in a Cities Skylines 2 situation of forever trying to fix a thing that people were having issues with.
Is not fixable potentially. Yeah, that one really sucked. And then last year you had Hyenas, which was the like
about that too.
Yeah, I think like that was kind of the thing, right? Was a lot of people forgot about Hyenas. It was that like looter shooter extraction game from, I'm forgetting who it was from. Oh my god, it was being published by Sega. It had all those little Sega references in it. I forget who developed it.
Creative Assembly.
Thank you. It's Creative Assembly. Yeah, like doing something super duper different, like totally out of their usual wheelhouse, right? Doing this like live service extraction shooter thing. And that had a beta, I'm pretty sure. That was like playable. It had a beta. And I think the interest just, again, I think it was a bit of a Concord situation where the interest just was not there.
Yeah.
I think no one was invested in it. No one was like particularly jazzed about it. And I think they just saw they saw what was happening before it was even coming, right? And that game was also basically at the finish line, and they just didn't release it.
I think that's a real symptom of the like going back to the scale of the live service games that we have now, right? That I was talking about.
Yeah.
That you could have launched that game 10 years ago, and maybe it wouldn't do super well, but like you would at least have enough players who aren't super bought into their one thing they spend all their time on. They'll be like, yeah, like, sure, I'll check this out. Like, it's a new game. Cool. You know, I had friends who used to just hop from like every new MMO that was coming out. They'd play it for like 3 months and then they'd probably move on to something else. But that was, 3 months of subscription revenue they were giving to that game or whatever. And that wasn't enough to sustain an MMO, because MMOs are incredibly big and expensive. But like for a live service game, if you have some people hopping on and playing it for a little while, like that's probably fine. But that's just a harder and harder pull now when there's so many games people can be playing that are either their big monolith games that they spend all their time in, or they hop into a little indie game that you play for 4 hours and, have a nice experience, and then you feel satisfied and done with it. It's really hard to launch a new live service game unless it has like a really good pull.
You're kind of pointing out how competitive the scene for all shooter games is still, right? I mean, quite a few of these are either arena shooters or they're third-person shooters, or there's something else. And that space is, I'm not one person who plays many of them, so I admit they kind of all look the same to me, and it's not a surprise to me when they come or go, but that scene is clearly still competitive. I was just thinking, as you're naming all of these that I forgot existed, I was like, wait, what about X Defiant? That thing that was a Tom Clancy game with the serial number file. Right? Yeah, it
still exists.
It launched a few months ago. I didn't notice. You could have told me that it unlaunched, that it never launched, that I had hallucinated it, and I would have believed any of those things had happened.
Well, that is what happened with the previous Ubisoft shooter that I can't even remember the name of. That was the Tops of Skyscrapers game. That one lasted 6 months, maybe.
You're not talking about The Division, Tops of Skyscrapers.
No, it was like a very airborne FPS, like a very vertical scale FPS. It was not around for very long. It was called Hyperloop or some shit like that. I can't remember.
I have no idea. Someone's gonna remember who's listening. Someone's gonna tell us.
Yeah,
please.
If you remember, you are one of the few people who paid any attention to
who did
to Ubisoft's last attempted live service game that did not take off. Yeah.
Damn. Oh, well, also shout out. It's not PC. But shout out to Bushiroad for announcing and unannouncing the worldwide version of Love Live School Idol Festival 2, which is a mobile rhythm game. They in a single tweet revealed the launch and also revealed the closure of the game, which truly magnificent. I don't know if I've ever seen anything
launch
like
to
it.
Unlaunch pipeline is just a circle. There's no. There was nothing there.
Games launching in January. By the way, games closing in March. Which amazing. Never seen that before.
When the limited time event is the game.
I looked it up and I was actually close. It was Hyperscape, not Hyperloop.
Hyperscape. That rings a bell. Actually,
that's a name I heard once or twice.
It made about 18 months and then they closed its doors. Yeah, that's almost like a success for a live service game. Like obviously that's not a success, but for a game to last 18 months now, it feels like you either got to break into the big leagues or like your days are numbered, right?
I feel like
it's a shame.
That's what people are giving it, like a year and a half. Babylon's Fall, let that Square Enix published
Platinum,
MMO. Platinum, thank you. That got like a year. Shout out to Tech Radar's Dashwood for being
that's right,
the one person that was still playing that game.
One player online.
You represented a full like 1.5% of the population.
Yeah.
But before we close out, I wanted to mention something that goes back to, Lauren, you talking about sort of player investment in these games and how much like, do you have some degree of ownership if you've dropped a bunch of money on cosmetics for one of these games and then it goes offline? I think it's a question we'll keep coming back to for many years as more and more of these kind of games come offline, and like the legal end result answer is no, you don't, like
those things
luck.
Are accounted for ahead of time in the EULAs or in the terms of service. Is that right?
Yeah, but it's an interesting question, and I was actually reading a legal paper like a month ago where I was doing some research on emulation, and I ended up reading this really long, very legalese, heavy paper about it was actually as much about decompilations as it was emulation. If you're not familiar with decomps, it's basically people taking the code of like an N64 game, re-implementing it in a different programming language so that if you plug in a ROM with like all of the assets, you have basically recreated a native PC version of that old game without it using any of the original code, right? So people sort of use the legal defense of like, well, it doesn't have any of the original code, therefore it's totally fine, right? In reality, like pretty dicey to be releasing something that involves this intellectual property, blah, 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 like it's complicated. But this paper was making what I thought was a really cool argument going back to John Locke's labor theory of property, which maybe I studied in philosophy class.
Yes.
or econ or something like decades ago. Did not remember it.
The ultimate destination of this podcast.
Yeah. This is where you thought this was going, right? But basically what this argument came down to, and I'm way oversimplifying it, is if you take a game like Mario 64 that has been around for decades, people have talked about it as like one of the greatest games ever made, right? There's a huge fan investment in arguably making that game what it is today based on the amount of YouTube videos people have made about that game, the ROM hacks people have made of that game, the speedrunning community, the A-button challenge where people have tried to beat that game without jumping like in any single level, right? Like there are all of these things that people have imbued that game with that arguably gives them, under this theory, some degree of ownership in what it is today, not what it was like when it was released, but what it represents today. And that arguably under this theory, if you're someone who's like modding this game or releasing, a decompilation of this game, you actually have some degree of right to the emotional and like programming labor that you have put into that. And that under that theory, those kind of like fan works could be construed as legal. Would that hold up in any court in the world? Maybe not. But it was a really cool legal theory. The paper was called Nerds versus Nintendo, I believe. Nerds v Nintendo. If you want to look it up,
an eternal battle.
It's by a lawyer named Kirk Sigmund, who wrote I thought it was a really cool like take on this topic. And we will often argue that like people who love games, people who are invested in games, like should have. We argue like morally in favor of fan games and things like that.
Yeah.
We don't have like the legal language ourselves as writers to make like the legal argument for those things existing. And we kind of just go, well, based on the precedent as we understand it, like they're not legal, but they're great. We give it a thumbs up. So I was quite like heartened to have this like actual, lawyers
someone
take
put it in
on,
legal.
Someone put it in legal terms. Like, here's a way this could be a thing that like you could have some degree of real ownership over this stuff. So it doesn't exactly apply to the skins and live service stuff we were talking about, but it's like a very adjacent topic. So if you're someone who would enjoy reading 40 pages of legal theory on like digital property ownership, maybe go check it out. I don't know.
Don't threaten me with a good time. Awesome. Thank you, Wes, for bringing so much research and expertise.
Thank you, Wes.
To the...
We could never.
We could never. No, this is why we call in Wes. Well, that is many unlaunched games that we've talked about, various different situations, how those things go down. Obviously, you can find Wes's writing about emulation and Nintendo things, quite a bit of it, at pcgamer.com. If you're curious about more of his thoughts on those things, along with all of our usual news, reviews, guides, opinions, and all that. And then, as usual, you'll be able to talk with Mollie and I about this week's episode at forums.pcgamer.com. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.